Imagine sitting across from a man who carries an entire nation on his shoulders. A man tall not only in stature, but in presence. Someone who seems carved from granite, slow in movement, precise in words, but unshakable in conviction. Now imagine asking him to surrender. He wouldn't. Not to his superiors, not to Hitler, not even to history itself. This is the story of Charles de Gaulle, the soldier who refused to bow, the exile who became a symbol, and the president who rebuilt a nation in his own stubborn image. If you look at his early life, nothing screams future savior of France, yet everything quietly points to it. Born on November 22, 1890, in Lille, to a Catholic, intellectual family, Charles was surrounded by books, history, and debates at the dinner table. He was fascinated by war stories, especially tales of knights and generals. As a child, he reportedly imagined battles in the schoolyard, pretending he defended France from invaders. But these weren't just childish fantasies. They hinted at a mind deeply fixated on national destiny. His father encouraged independent thought, and young Charles adopted a steadfast belief: nations rise and fall on the courage of a few. He attended the elite military academy, St. Cyr, where he cultivated a reputation as brilliant, arrogant, and relentless. Fellow cadets joked that de Gaulle didn't simply walk, he marched. That combination of intellect and stubbornness became his trademark. When World War I erupted, he was an infantry officer fighting in the hellscape of Verdun. In 1916, he was wounded and taken prisoner after leading a desperate defense. And here begins one of the most fascinating, almost cinematic parts of his story. Charles de Gaulle attempted escape around 5 times. Each plan was daring, but each time he was recaptured. His captors considered him a nuisance, a troublesome prisoner, because he simply wouldn't accept captivity. Think about what that says. Years before he would defy Hitler, he practiced by defying the walls around him. After World War I, de Gaulle became a military theorist. He had ideas, big ones. He proposed using fast, mechanized armored divisions as the future of warfare. He saw clearly that the next conflict would be won by the army that moved the fastest and struck the hardest. But the French military leadership, conservative and nostalgic, rejected his ideas. Ironically, the Germans embraced similar strategies. When World War II erupted, de Gaulle watched his predictions unfold in real time as German tanks swept across Europe. In 1940, when France was collapsing under the Blitzkrieg, de Gaulle became one of the only French officers who achieved a significant counterattack. He was promoted to brigadier general at just 49 years old. But even that wasn't what defined him, it was what came next. In June 1940, France prepared to sign an armistice with Germany. Many leaders accepted defeat. But Charles de Gaulle did not. In a moment of incredible audacity, he fled to London and delivered a speech on the BBC. His message was clear: France had lost a battle, but not the war. Even more remarkable, he wasn't speaking for a government. He was speaking for an idea. He was, at that moment, essentially a one-man resistance movement. Most French people didn't even hear the speech. Radios were controlled, and the message traveled slowly. But as the occupation intensified, the words became a beacon. The idea of free France took root. Think about the courage this requires. He was a relatively unknown general without political power, exiled from his country, condemned to death by the Vichy regime, and yet he declared himself the voice of France. This wasn't ego, it was purpose. In interviews later, he explained that someone had to stand up and say, "France will rise again." And he believed, with absolute certainty, that if no one else did it, he must. Throughout the war, he clashed constantly with Winston Churchill. Their relationship was a mixture of respect, frustration, and mutual stubbornness. Churchill once said that when dealing with de Gaulle, "The hardest cross I have to bear is the cross of Lorraine," the symbol of free France. De Gaulle was difficult, but his difficulty came from a deep fear that France, already humiliated by defeat, would also lose its independence to its own allies. His primary mission wasn't only liberation, but preserving French sovereignty. And when Paris was finally liberated in 1944, de Gaulle marched triumphantly down the Champs-Élysées, refusing protection, walking straight through cheering crowds while snipers still fired from the rooftops. Surrounded by danger, he didn't flinch. For him, showing fear would dishonor the moment. After the war, he briefly served as the leader of France, but, true to form, he resigned when he felt politicians were weakening the country through constant infighting. He retreated to Colombe-de-Lusiglies, his quiet village, writing memoirs and waiting. This waiting period says a lot about the man. He didn't chase power, but he believed that if France needed him again, he would be called. And indeed, in 1958, during the crisis in Algeria, France was on the brink of civil war. The political system, the Fourth Republic, was collapsing. People turned to de Gaulle as the one figure strong enough to restore order. He returned to power under one condition. He would rewrite France's constitution. And he did. He created the Fifth Republic, giving the president strong executive powers. Many criticized him for concentrating authority, but he insisted that France needed stability, not endless weak coalition governments. His presidency, spanning a decade, was marked by major decisions: ending the Algerian War, granting independence to former colonies, withdrawing France from NATO's integrated command, and asserting France's nuclear force. Every move reinforced his belief in national independence. Love him or hate him, you always knew exactly what he stood for. But even great leaders face crises. In 1968, student protests and massive strikes brought France to a standstill. For a moment, it looked like he might lose control. He disappeared briefly to a military base in Germany, not to flee, but to ensure the army stood with the Republic. Then he returned and addressed the nation with a firm, resonant voice. Within days, millions marched in support of the government. The crisis passed, but de Gaulle, now older, understood that his time was nearing an end. In 1969, after losing a referendum, he resigned, quietly, almost symbolically. The man who had saved France twice left the stage without applause. He spent his final year writing and reflecting until November 1970, when he died suddenly at home. France entered a period of national mourning. Even political enemies acknowledged his impact. To this day, de Gaulle is remembered not as a perfect man. He was stubborn, proud, demanding to the point of exasperation, but as a giant, shaped by duty. One of his most famous lines was, "France cannot be France without greatness," and he lived by it. His entire life was an attempt to drag his country toward that greatness, whether it wanted it or not. What makes Charles de Gaulle such an engaging figure for storytelling is that his life reads like a myth, yet every part is grounded in history. The arrogant young officer who predicted the future of warfare, the prisoner who refused to stay locked up, the exiled general who claimed to speak for a defeated nation, the president who rebuilt the structure of modern France. His story is a reminder that sometimes a nation's fate hinges on one individual's refusal to accept the unacceptable. And that's why years after his death, Charles de Gaulle still looms large in French identity. He wasn't lovable, he wasn't easy, but he was necessary. He taught a nation that pride can be a burden, but also a shield. And in the darkest hours of the 20th century, when France seemed lost, he stood alone and said, "No, we will not fall." It's one of the most powerful stories of leadership in modern history, a story of grit, vision, and an iron will that outlived the man himself.